Well, welcome to a new series this morning. Um, and I'm going to start in this new series by talking about the men's locker room at the YMCA. So the men's locker room at the YMCA, one person described it to me as a center of all known human intelligence. If you want to know something, the guys in the locker room, they can tell you exactly what the truth is. And, one thing about the locker room, there's a few TVs, if you can imagine, in there. And oftentimes, not often, all the time, it's either a news program, and so, some gravitate toward the section where CNN plays, and some gravitates toward Fox plays, so sometimes there's news going on, and sometimes there's sports going on, and that's pretty much it, news and sports. But I noticed a big difference here in the last, I want to say, 4 weeks or so. It was kind of subtle to begin with, but now when I walk in, invariably, what's on the TVs? Andy Griffith. Andy Griffith. And, it took me a while before I noticed, and I thought, wait a second. I found myself stopping and watching and longing for the days of Andy Griffith, longing for a very different time than the time in which we live. In fact, I'm going to add to that and say, I have the rich privilege and joy of working with our brother Corey and our brother Don on a football officiating crew. And so Friday nights, we're out there, the football game. We were at Harding County Friday night. You get to a small town, and everybody's out. And we're standing on the sidelines before the game, the hat off and held up here while some young lady bravely sings the national anthem. And I got to tell you, I get choked up. I mean, it's still, I've been doing this for a lot of years, but I still stand on the sidelines and I get choked up at the national anthem thinking, and I'm looking around thinking, this is Americana. This feels good. I am so glad to be here. And then we continue, and of course we get lots of free counsel along the way in the game. But and so there's a sense of things aren't right. I feel like the Jewish exiles in Psalm 137 who sat down by the rivers of a foreign land and wept. There's a sense of this just doesn't feel right. Something is wrong. This is not what we grew up with, minus 1968. This is not what we grew up with. Things are not as what they should be. Let me just run through, give you a little picture. What's very clear, what was once good is now really declared evil. And what is evil is now declared good. The religious liberty of the First Amendment, should be familiar with the First Amendment, is right before our eyes, is slipping away, making room for the newfound yet unwritten new amendment, sexual liberty, sexual freedom. And drowning in this wake of sexual freedom is 61 million murdered babies. Drowning in this wake, 40% of children today are born to an unmarried woman. That's pretty near half. 24 million. Try to capture that. 24 million children are living with an unmarried parent. Doesn't take a whole lot of research to go through all the statistics with that. It's very much a part of my world. in dealing with social issues. But women who have children outside of marriage are younger on average, have less education, have lower income than married parents. Children who are born to unmarried parents are more likely to live in poverty and to have poor developmental outcomes. And that's just a fact. I mean, that's what we're living with. You know, I like to stop and tell some of my friends, so how's this whole thing working for you? In fact, here's one more I would add. A woman living with her boyfriend is 11 times more likely to be abused, her or her children. 11 times. Yep. And that's the direction that we're marching down. Well, let's throw out things like capitalism. Capitalism that's at the heart of the greatest economy that this world has ever seen is progressively giving way to a type of economy that has had no measurable level of success, ever, and invariably leads to elitism. Or let's talk about the answer to addressing the disproportionate level of racially based arrests and killings is to defund the police. Bizarre. The term anarchy pops into my head. Really? Defund the police? That's a good solution. Brilliant. We're talking about bizarre. In a truly bizarre wordplay of Orwellian standards, under threat of a nation who's recognizing milestone achievements in economy, science, social standards, and innovation, comes the movement called Antifa. And Antifa, which uses fascist-like methods of oppression and the quelling of dialogue in the name of battling fascism. Truly bizarre. So, yeah, you're taking a look at all these things, and you know, we're living in western South Dakota where we're relatively isolated. Relatively. But I tell you that outside is slowly shrinking in. We're not going to be isolated forever. Not only this, but when we talk about how things once were, our children and our grandchildren have no memory of this. They have no clue what we're talking about. They have no idea. Like the pilgrims who left the Netherlands for fear of losing their children to an ungodly culture, the world's influence is growing right before our eyes on our young people. So I'm going to tie all these things together and say, in other words, we're living in Babylon. That's where we are. We're in Babylon. And so using this theme of living in Babylon, we're going to take on a series that's going to take us up through the end of this year, up to January 1st. So we're going to take on a series of topics that are tied in with what life is like living in Babylon and how we respond accordingly. These key issues, really at the heart of it, is being a Christian in a land that is increasingly hostile to Christianity. And while these lessons are for all of us, I will say, given that Netherlands comment earlier, while they're certainly for all of us, the particular focus is going to be on the young people, trying to make sense of this world as you begin your adult lives. So particular focus there. And so so lessons that we're going to be taking a look at. We start today with what is Babylon. When we're talking about Babylon, what exactly are we talking about? Next week already, we're going to jump into our heavenly citizenship versus Babylonian citizenship as we consider our really dual citizenship. We're going to take a look at the biblical role of government and our response, social justice and BLM, fascism and Antifa, the newfound amendment of sexual liberty. I've got a lesson left over from last spring that never really got to on transgender. Pilgrims living in the Netherlands. We're going to take a look at entertainment, living as salt and light, and that if you do the math, you didn't count 13 of them because I'm anticipating that some might take longer than others, and there might be new topics that emerge as well. By the time we're done with this series, I pray that we will all be better equipped to fight the good fight against our three enemies. And our three enemies are Satan, the world, and our own flesh. So hoping that we become better equipped to fight the good fight. And so with that, let's launch into what is Babylon. So let's open our Bibles, please. Go to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. And if you do have a question, just indicate, raise your hand, and we're going to send out our assistant, Emma, with the microphone to capture your question. So she'll run and get you over there. She got her tennis shoes on, too. All right. So Genesis chapter 11, you're familiar with this. You're familiar with the Tower of Babel. In verse 4 says, "And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.'" So with that statement, with that desire, what we have here at the Tower of Babel, what we have here is the mankind's arrogance on display. Come, let us make a name for ourselves. So in this arrogance, which led then to outright rebellion against God. And what characterized this arrogance, what characterized this rebellion, is man exalting self. Okay, I am exalting myself. And so this whole concept, when we talked last spring about humanism, that was birthed in the garden, that desire to be as God, replacing God with self. I'm going to be God. So what got birthed in the garden is now reaching its adolescence. It's now reaching a time where the rebellion just gets extended, and now let us make a name for ourselves. But I draw attention to the Tower of Babel, which, by the way, Babel literally means confusion. But Babel is actually the same word that we find with Babylon. So that concept of exalting self, it starts already there in Babel. The next time we see Babylon is in Joshua chapter 7. Joshua chapter 7, take a look at verses 21 and 22. Go ahead and turn your Bibles there. And this whole thing about, just want to make the point here about exalting self. or exalting mankind. Genesis chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. I'm going to start with verse 20. This is the account of Achan. Remember the Battle of Ai, where they went in and said, let's just send a few guys. You know, there's a piece of cake. We'll just take care of this. But then they ended up getting defeated. So what was going on there? Well, Joshua's checking it out. In verse 20, and Achan answered Joshua and said, indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I have done. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. And there they are, hidden in the earth, in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. And so we see right there, that's our next introduction to Babylon or Babylonian. And you can see that in this, Achan saw that the spoils were beautiful. They were alluring. Already, right there, Babylon is being equated with something desirable. And I'm going to say the word alluring. And we'll tie these together, but it's alluring. It's something that contributed to Achan's lure into sin. It's something that's beautiful. So next place we're going to go is to 2 Kings. No, I'm sorry, Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah. Isaiah 39. Okay, Isaiah 39, we're going to take a look at the first 8 verses. Dealing with Hezekiah, King Hezekiah and his illness, and Isaiah's prophecy. Starting at verse 1, at that time Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. And Hezekiah was pleased with them and showed them the house of his treasures, the silver and gold, the spices and precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said to him, what did these men say? And from where did they come to you? So Hezekiah said, they came to me from a far country, from Babylon. And he said, what have they seen in your house? So Hezekiah answered, they have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among the treasures that I have not shown them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord which you have spoken is good. For he said, at least there will be peace and truth in my days. So here, when this envoy came to encourage him and wish him well for having recovered and everything else, they came to him where Hezekiah detected no threat. They didn't come with some banners held high ready for war or anything. They came really somewhat deceptive. And there was no threat detected by Hezekiah. It wasn't until the word of the Lord came to Isaiah that cast a light on what this threat was all about. I still marvel at Hezekiah's response. And in some way, and I realize this might be kind of a stretch, in some way it makes me think of even today when I learned this week that the national debt is now equal to the annual gross domestic product of the United States. Phew, at least it's not going to be in our time. Our kids and our grandkids are going to have to deal with it. So I see that with Hezekiah's response. At least there's peace and truth in my days. But the thing that I'd like to point out in this account is that this came with no apparent threat. Of course, we know that all changed, as next comes the Babylonian captivity. 2 Kings 24:21, thus Judah was carried away captive from its own land, where all that was in Judah's house, guess what? This is according to what Isaiah said, where all that was in Judah's house was carried away to Babylon. Judah's sons became eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And so now we enter into Babylonian captivity. So it is in this time, that we find people living by faith while surrounded by ungodliness. All that the people had known by now was just a memory. So now you're taken away captive, you're carried out of your land, you're put into a foreign land. Everything that you knew before, longed for, is back over here. These people who longed for this, they witnessed the deaths of their family members and neighbors. They're surrounded by an ungodly culture. And life was hard. Life was hard under captivity. Jeremiah lamented, if you go to Lamentations chapter 1, the first 4 verses, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into captivity. Under affliction and hard servitude she dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. The roads to Zion mourn, because no one comes to the set feast. All her gates are desolate, her priests sigh, her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Things don't look good. They're now carried away into captivity. What was beautiful and alluring before, what is driven by exaltation of mankind, is now, we're living in the midst of it, and in varying degrees, we'll talk about that a little bit, in varying degrees, there is affliction. Yet there's hope. Jeremiah prophesies that this captivity is temporary. Isaiah 14 verse 3 says, "It shall come to pass in the day the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve." And of course we know that this promise was later fulfilled. King Cyrus sent a remnant of God's people back to Jerusalem. And so all this little survey that we did in the Old Testament, I just kind of want to summarize to just give you the picture of what we're talking about, tying it all together with Babylon. So thus far, we've got the Tower of Babel, which is equated with man exalts self over God. Then we have Achan's sin, talking about the Babylonian lure. And then we have Hezekiah's tour. And that with his tour, there's no threat. Never mind the man behind the curtain. Then we've got the Babylonian captivity. And with this captivity, this is God's people living in the world. Ultimately, that's where we're going to be going to. We have Jeremiah's lamentation. Persecution. And a comment about that persecution that's again on varying degrees. Some areas of our world is a greater persecution than others, or different types of persecution, but that is common, the persecution. And then later on, the remnant returns to Jerusalem. And with that, there is hope. And so when we take a look at these things that we're drawing out of our little survey, our little Old Testament survey of Babylon, notice the parallel that we observe between the parallel of these things with Babylon and sin and salvation. And so, man in paradise. This is God's people in Judah, in the promised land. In paradise, things are good. And so parallel that with having been taken into the promised land. Man is tempted, the desire to be as God, like the Tower of Babel. The appeal of sin, like Achan and the Babylonian lure. Underestimating the gravity of consequences. Let's see if we can go look at that. Go to Genesis chapter 3. Chapter 3. This well-known account. So here's the woman and the serpent, and here's the serpent giving that lure. You shall not eat it, or I'm sorry, you will not surely die. For God knows that in the day of your eyes will be open, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and here it comes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate. Also, what you can find in there is underestimating the gravity of consequences. And so notice that parallel with Hezekiah, showing people around from Babylon underestimating the gravity of the consequences, driven by that desire to make one wise, the desire to be as God. And so then we have the fall into sin. And that fall into sin, let's parallel that with the Babylonian captivity. And so now, here we are, living by faith while surrounded by ungodliness. And granted, there was a time in this nation when that was made easier by the culture and such, but it was always there. Living by faith while surrounded by ungodliness. Then look at that parallel, Jeremiah's lamentation. That's hardship under persecution. And then there's that future hope. That future hope parallels redemption and the return to paradise. So notice that those parallels going forth. And now for the next step, let's just take a look at New Testament use of Babylonian imagery. Let's go ahead and turn. Just a very simple one. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to take a look at verse 13. One of those verses that's just real easy to gloss over. Chapter 5, verse 13. Peter is ending his book. The Apostle Peter is ending his book, sending out the greetings and such. And in this one, he ends, "She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son." She who is in Babylon? Who in the world is that? Some commentators identify Rome as a type of Babylon. Some commentators identify this as the church in Babylon under this Babylonian captivity. When we talk about Rome, why Rome? What was it about Rome that would elicit such harsh association? Well, Rome exalted itself, sort of like the Tower of Babel. Rome persecuted the church, just like the Babylonian captivity, and Rome would one day be destroyed, the future hope. So again, there are those parallels. Now let's take a look at Revelation chapter 18. Now, if we talk about Babylon and Revelation, I'll just tell you that you got to go to Pastor Fagre's class on Revelation Sunday nights, because this is rich. Very rich. And we're not going to do it justice this morning, I can tell you that, when we go through all this. But Revelation, let's just take a look at chapter 18, verses 9 and 10. "The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her being Babylon, will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." So here we see the final destruction of Babylon. Now, that final destruction of Babylon, is that talking about Rome? Is that talking about the United States of America? Is it what in the world? Is it talking about the Babylonian Empire? Well, I think it's much more so than that, and I think for years and years, and every generation reads something like this and equates Babylon with whatever's happening in their contemporary setting. But this brings us to tying this all together with what are we talking about, giving that definition to Babylon. And I'm going to give you the short definition first. The short definition: the world. When the Bible talks about the world, it's talking about ungodliness. So more specifically, Babylon is driven by ungodliness for the oppression of the church. That's what it means to be living in Babylon. It's driven to oppression of the church. Fueled by Satan, Babylon is manifest in pockets of persecution that escalates in varying degrees, whether it be politically, militarily, economically, through education, entertainment, and a general culture that approves evil as good and good as evil. We're talking about the world here. And so this manifestation of all these different areas thus forms the topics of our study this semester on what it means to be living in Babylon. We're living in the world, and we're living in a world who seeks to destroy the church, who seeks to capture our young, who seeks to lure us away from the faith. That's what we're living in. And so, speaking of living in Babylon, here's the interesting little twist. We hold citizenship of Babylon. We are Babylonian citizens, by the way. We have been carried away captive. Like the exiles of old, we have been carried away captive. And while our Babylonian citizenship is in the United States of America, we have brothers and sisters all over the world whose Babylonian citizenship is in China, Sudan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Germany, Poland, Vietnam, and everywhere else in this world. Along with our Babylonian citizenship, we also hold heavenly citizenship. So we have a dual citizenship. And what does that mean, living in dual citizenship? So next week, we're going to continue our Living in Babylon series with what it means then to hold dual citizenship, or to, I think it was Schaeffer who said this, how then shall we live as dual citizens in this land? So that does raise the question of how then do we live in this world? Yep, there's the outlook. You don't polish the brass on a sinking ship. But that's not the approach that we're taking. Well, and in talking about contentment, see, that's the point. There's a lot of alluring things in this world. There's a lot of things that would like to reach us, grab us, and pull us into the world, and pull us away from the church and into the world. Yeah, it's a discontent with God's provision. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I cannot overstate the lure. You know, I remember well as a young man, where all of my high school and college years were in the 70s. That was a rough decade. Because that was right in the middle of the revolution, so to speak. It was rough. I want to take what we experienced then and multiply that 10 times over with what's being confronted today. Yeah. You know, just a quick comment on that. There are a number of responses. One of the response that we've seen that you alluded to, which is absolutely true, the church, and I can only speak historically about the church in the United States. The church has a history of changing and adapting to do just as you said, to be friends with the world. Everything from, probably the most obvious right now is being a part of this diversity and inclusion culture that must embrace the newfound sexual liberty, in the church bending over backwards to accommodate that. So the church along the way has unquestionably lost its salt, it's lost its light, it's lost the truth. And I would say, and I appreciate the challenge of living dangerously. We do live dangerously. I'm going to suggest as we go through those, but would invite discussion along the way as we get into the citizenship, that what I don't want to do is set up the false dichotomy where it's either this or this. So generally, wisdom would explore several different ways, but whatever way that we respond, whether with a smile or whether with hard rhetoric or whatever, our response has to be founded on the truth of the Bible, and no compromise with the truth. And just a couple of quick comments, because it really does dig into details of next week's lesson. You know, the things that have been said is a reminder that we are not to be conformed to this world. We are to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So we do not live according to the standards of the world. We live according to the standards of the Bible. And that begins with yourself, and it begins with your sanctification, with your Bible reading, with your prayer, with your engagement in the church, doing those things. And while I know that, I know in the evangelical world, the whole driving force is changing our culture. That ought not to be our driving force. Our driving force is honoring God. And if the culture changes or adapts, great, but we really should be of the mind that we are not going to conform to the world, but again be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we may prove what is that good and perfect and acceptable will of God, and that is talking about biblical standards, God's commands. So that's where we're going. And that is the case. And that when we take a look at Babylon, we take a look at living in Babylon, we know how this is going to end up. And we have confidence this is how it's going to end up. Can you imagine being one of the Babylonian captives taken from Judah into Babylon and living in that way and being told by prophecies that your time here is limited, that there will be a change coming up? Well, there will be a change, and we can say that with confidence, and that change is going to be good, and that is our hope. That's the hope that we talked about up there. Ultimately, we know where we're going to end up living. We know that our dual citizenship will be dropped, and we'll have our single citizenship in the new heavens and the new earth. Period. That's where we're headed. That's the end of the story. That's where we're going. But in the meantime, we're living here. How then shall we live? And that's really at the heart of the lessons that are coming up.